Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wildcast podcast. This is Michael Lev, senior writer and columnist for the Arizona Daily Star. I am joined today by the preeminent expert on women's college basketball on the West Coast, PJ Brown. PJ, how are you?
I'm doing good. How about you, Mike?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you. We're recording this on Monday afternoon. The women's basketball team has a little bit of a break this week, kind of a mini bye. Only one game on the docket. It's Friday, right? At
Yes.
Utah. They are coming off their biggest and best victory of the season by far, defeating number 16 West Virginia 77-62 this past Saturday night at McHale Center. West Virginia is now number 21 in the rankings, but they're still ranked. So that is still a ranked victory and a very good one. Arizona scored 77 points, which was one off the season high for a Mountaineers opponent this season. And they did that without one of their best offensive players in Lauren Swan. So really a breakthrough performance, put Arizona at 5-4 halfway through the Big 12 season. Only 18 games for the women in conference play, 20 for the men. So here we are, PJ. We're halfway through the inaugural season in the Big 12. Adia Barnes said the other night that it was a little harder than she thought, and the style of play is a little bit different. But how would you assess just kind of where the Wildcats are at this juncture of the season?
Sure. It's funny because if you would have asked me this a couple weeks ago, they were still trying to figure themselves out, right? They were sort of still in what you could have called a rough patch where they just weren't putting it all together, doing everything that they sort of were learning in practice and that they were seeing on film that they should be doing. And they just really couldn't figure it out. One player here or there would play really well. Brea Cunningham has always been steady. She's played great the entire season. But other than that, they would have one that kind of raised up. I mean, Jada did well. So we're not, Jada Williams has done well too, but they just didn't have a collective team effort. They couldn't get into a real offensive flow. The ball would get stagnant at times, and they just sort of couldn't get over this hump. And then they go to Kansas, and Adia Barnes works some magic in between the Kansas State game, which they lost, and the Kansas game. And all of a sudden they came out and looked like a completely different team. They were sharing the ball on offense. They were playing better defense that looks more like what we've come to know as Arizona defense, right? Swarming defense, helping your teammate and then getting back to your opponent that you're supposed to defend, really not working the angles, not giving them a lot of space to do their thing on offense and really disrupt. And it wasn't a one-off. So it worked at Kansas. They came home. They finally won a game at home against Cincinnati. Um, and then they did it again against one of the best teams in the country, West Virginia. So they've really found their footing, it just all came together. Very interesting because Adia Barnes said that she challenged her guards to step up because she said the post, Brea Cunningham and Isis Bay were playing so well, but she felt like the guards weren't doing their jobs, and they stepped up. All of them stepped up collectively. It's just like the light bulb went off all of a sudden for them. And it was a good time for it to happen because if it hadn't happened then, you know, as they keep playing more games and it's not happening, you don't know what's happening to their season, right? It's just sort of flying by them. So it was a great time to happen. And hopefully now that they sort of know how to do this and they're able to like build on it and get better as they go to peak, at the right time of the season, which is in February and hopefully into postseason play.
Yeah, when you look at the schedule, if they hadn't kind of righted the ship in these last three games, they could have been looking at a pretty long losing streak because they go to Utah on Friday, and Utah pummeled them at home on New Year's Eve. I think part of that was that sometimes when a team goes off for a couple days for Christmas break, they come back and they are just not in the right headspace. It didn't seem like Arizona was in the right headspace that day. I don't think the disparity between the two teams is as great as it looked, but still, Utah is a very tough place to play. They're 10-1 at home, and then they come back here and then they go to Colorado, which is also a very tough place to play. They are also 10-1 at home. You've got the altitude and all those things. They just beat Kansas State, though I guess Kansas State was without its best player. But it's always been a tough road trip. It's not exactly a back-to-back situation, but difficult places to play. So I think really important for them to have won these 3 games. When I look at the back half of the Big 12 slate, I can see a path to them going 6-3. That's to me kind of the best case scenario. Split against Utah, Colorado. TCU at home. That could be a tough game. They also have to go to Oklahoma State, also one of the better teams in the league. I think maybe the floor is 4-5. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they go 5-4, split the difference between 4-5 and 6-3. That would put them at 19-12 for the regular season, 10-8 for the Big 12 season, heading into the postseason play. Do you think at that point in time that they've done enough to make the NCAA tournament, or would they still maybe need to win a game or two in the conference tournament?
I think it's really close. I think, well, when you look at just winning games, they need to win 20 to be for sure in. So I think 19 is really close. And then maybe if you win a game at, in the Big 12 tournament, that's 20 that gets you there. Then you're maybe solidly in. Plus, the West Virginia game helps them tremendously. Not only is it a win over a ranked team, they were ranked 16, but they also had a really good net, which we haven't talked about yet. Their net ranking was 16. They didn't drop that far, West Virginia, in their net, I don't believe. But at this point, if you're Arizona, you're hoping that West Virginia wins, because then it shows how good that win really was at that point in the season. And then, if they could possibly, as long as we're talking about possibilities here, if they could knock off a TCU or an Oklahoma State, the Big 12 really seems this season like that there are no completely dominant teams, right? Everybody seems to be knocking off other teams. There's nobody except for TCU, who has been doing really well. They just don't seem to have that. Like, there's no UCLA or USC right now, or in the old Pac-12, Stanford, right? There's no sort of dominant teams. Almost all of them have lost. And it's kind of odd. It's not even, we're not even talking about Kansas State, who lost Ioka Lee, their best player, and then had a hard time at Colorado. But, Iowa State's had a hard time putting it together, and they have a lot of really great pieces. So there's a shot at Arizona maybe picking up another win that they shouldn't. But if it sounds cliche, but if they win the games they're supposed to win and maybe take one more that they're not, they're in. They're in solidly, because then you have 2 maybe ranked teams that you've beaten. You hit the 20, even if you hit the 19 mark, I think you hit the 20 mark. Their net has raised over probably about 25 points in the last week. I didn't check this morning, but when they beat Kansas and they beat Cincinnati, they went from 83 down to 60. So, and after beating West Virginia, they only went down to 59 on Monday morning. So, I mean, that's a big jump. And if they can keep it going in the right direction, they could be lined up to be in the NCAAs. There's a path.
Yeah, their current net rating is 57.
Okay, that's great.
West Virginia is 13.
Okay.
That was Arizona's first quad 1 victory of the season. When you look at their quad breakdown, they're 9-0 against quad 4 opponents, only 5-8 against quads 1 through 3. I was surprised, although it might sort of be a blessing in disguise, to see that NAU and GCU are both, higher than quad 4. Those were the kind of the splotches on their resume, those games, but those teams are pretty good. Like GCU is far and away the best team in their league, and NAU I think is the second best team in their league.
Yeah, it turns out that they're really good teams. They were at the time that they played them. So I think that, obviously that'll hurt them because they should have beat. Those are the games that you should win. But when these teams are actually better, it might sort of neutralize each other. Now, the one thing you may want to explain is this is the first year that women's basketball is going to the quad stuff. And I know men's basketball has used it before. Why don't you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, typically it's been, like quad 1 would be like top 25 opponents, and then quad 2 would be like 26 through 50. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, and I think it makes a difference too whether you're at home or on the road, but that's the basic idea of it, right? You're assessing the quality of your results based on where teams are stacking up and how they're stacking up. So, quad 4 is going to be the worst teams on your schedule, and they played some pretty bad teams this year, like Seattle and Chicago State and Bakersfield, some ones that are ranked pretty low. That was kind of intentional. Adia explained before the season that she didn't feel like she got the bang for her buck last year by playing a harder non-conference schedule. They also kind of suffered a little bit from the Big 12 not being as deep as the Pac-12 was in women's basketball. I mean, the Pac-12 was elite, right? Like best of the best, right up there with the SEC, maybe even better than the SEC. When you go consider all the teams in the league, when you have a bigger league like this, 16 teams, it's hard to have 15 good opponents, So one of the important things about when you look at the structure of the league and the postseason tournament is there's a double bye system, right? So you want to be in the top 8 if you can. You don't get the double bye, only the top 4 get the double bye. But if you're in the top 8, you do not have to play on that first day. And that sets you up for success, right? Like if you're in that 9 through 16 and you want to try to like win the tournament and steal a bid, you have to play 5 days in a row. And that is a really, really difficult proposition. So they're currently sitting in 8th. I think if they just kind of keep the pace that they're on right now, like you said, kind of beat the teams that they're supposed to beat, they should be in good shape to land in that top 8, which is where you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when you're talking about quad, so women's basketball did something similar, but they never called it quad, right? So they would evaluate your wins, your losses, if you won it at home, who you played, if you won at home, if it was a good win, a bad loss, a good loss, all of that kind of stuff. I remember Dawn Staley from South Carolina telling me once she was always surprised how teams from the East Coast really didn't go west to schedule for non-conference because everybody has a hard time scheduling the non-conference games. And you know that Adia's had a really difficult time doing that during her tenure here. And Dawn told me right out, she said, I don't understand what these coaches are doing because if you go somewhere and you lose, it's a good loss because you lost away as opposed to losing at home. So she didn't understand why more teams didn't do this, didn't travel and didn't play tougher teams and maybe, or even teams that were at their same level, but just away from home. And, that's always a good question. We don't know why that's happened because it's more points and it helps you
Money.
When the committee is looking at you're playing for the NCAA tournament after all.
Yeah, is money the reason? Like, just it's expensive,
Yeah, but then they would
travel.
they would do, like Dawn did this a couple times, where she came out west and she scheduled like a couple games in California and then would go home. So
Okay.
you could do that. I mean, some team could come here and play Arizona State and get a couple of games and then, fly home. So, but they just
Yeah.
don't. I don't know
Yeah.
why.
Well, maybe it's because it's happening on a regular basis in the Big Ten and the ACC within the conference, like because there's no choice with these teams being stationed on the West Coast, that whole ridiculous thing where we could talk about forever. So here's a little bit more on the net from an article on ESPN from September. A game at home against a team ranked between 1 to 25 in the net on a neutral court would be 1 to 35, on the road 1 to 40. Those are all classified as quad one. So there's a sliding scale depending on where the games take place. But if U of A women's basketball fans want to monitor those types of things over the course of the season, that's kind of the key to figuring that out. ESPN did do a bracketology fairly recently on 127. I guess that's today.
Yeah.
So they have Arizona in the next 4 out category. Looks, if I'm reading it correctly, they would be like the 7th team out. So they're knocking on the door.
They
right?
are.
They're definitely trending in the right direction.
They weren't in the conversation before. So being there is great at this point because you have, 6 more weeks of the season to do something?
Exactly. So here's the philosophical question that I want to ask you. Would it be better to sneak into the NCAA tournament or to make the WBIT, which is what the WNIT is now called, 32-team format? Maybe you get to play a bunch of games at home. A young team previously under Adia Barnes used the WNIT as a springboard to bigger and better things later on. So how do you feel about like those two possibilities?
Yeah. The year they made their run in the WNIT, I actually thought it was better that they made the WNIT because that team, it just wasn't ready, and they probably would have lost in the first round. Although they played really well, but they sort of got that chip on their shoulder, like, we didn't make it and nobody believes in us, so we're going to win this thing. So it was a completely different mentality that they wouldn't have had if they would have gotten into the NCAAs. This year, I think it's a little too early to say that because I'd like to see how far they can continue, if they continue this type of play, right? If they keep getting better, if they knock off a couple, like another team, if they do what they're supposed to do, right? Which is find that path, they may be playing at a level that allows them to make the second round of the tournament or surprise somebody and maybe go to the Sweet 16. I mean, we don't know. We don't know what's still left in this team yet. So I think it's a little too early to say that. Now, if they go out and they just lose the next 9 games, well then, yeah, if they make the WBIT, that's good because that's probably where they belong. Well, 9 games, they probably won't make it. But if they lose a bunch and they don't continue on this trend where they're playing together as a team and going toe-to-toe with some of the best teams in the country, then, all bets are off.
Yeah, that bracketology had 7 Big 12 teams in the field, by the way. So there is respect for the league. And there's a lot of newness to college basketball this year with how big the SEC and the Big 10 and Big 12 have gotten, ACC as well. There's just more teams. The bulk of the teams are going to come from those leagues. So when you see like a huge number next to, number of SEC teams in or Big 10 teams in, realize that the leagues themselves are bigger than they used to be. And you've got really good teams from the former Pac-12 in those leagues now. And they're, going to have a regular presence in the tournament. Want to talk about a few individual players while we're here. Jada Williams was not one of the girls who was brought in to speak to us on the podium after the game against West Virginia. She had a good game though. And
Oh,
what
she
I
was.
liked about her game was she was able to hit outside shots, and it had to be killing her to have worked so hard during the offseason on her outside shot. And then you looked at the stats, and her percentages are down, both 2 points, 2 point shots, and 3 point shots. So in that game, she hit 3 out of 6 from 3 point range, 4 out of 7 overall. I looked it up. That 7 field goal attempts were her fewest in a game in which she played 30 or more minutes. So I like when she plays the true point guard type of role. And Brea Cunningham, her buddy, was asked a little bit about it toward the end, how the two of them were working the pick and roll game. And she passed up a couple shots, good shots to get great shots, right? She hit Brea rolling to the basket. So I really liked what I saw from Jada in that game. There's been some times this year where I felt like she's kind of dribbled herself into trouble a little bit. The shot clock runs down. She ends up taking a bad shot. She was more of a distributor in this game. I think if she takes less than 10 shots in a game and they still score 70 plus points, then that means the offense is probably working pretty well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that have gone into that. I think, her ankle and her Achilles are still bothering her. Maybe not the last couple games, but they were about a month ago when I talked to her. And I think that Achilles will always bother her until she's able to take a good break, like maybe a month off. And who knows if or when that will happen, because she's such a hard worker that even in the off season, even if she gets a couple weeks off from Adia and goes home, she's probably like itching to get into the gym because that's just who she is. So that Achilles will probably be bothering her for a long time. I think that another thing, when I talked to her, earlier, she said that it's difficult not having like a Puello there. So a Helena Puello who was a solid player. She could rely on her. And, at the end of last season, Puello kind of took over in terms of her shot making and all of that. And not having a player on the court with her who was like that, I personally feel that maybe then she took some of that on her own, maybe felt more pressure, like, I got to do it, right? If I don't have somebody else next to me who can do it, then I've got to do it. What's happened over since the Big 12 season has started is, Lauren Swan's come into her own and she's done really well. And so that's somebody that can help a Jada. Or there were times when Jada is on the court with Lauren and Maylene Rolfe, who also help. And Adia said they create shots for Jada. And so there's not as much pressure. It's not like I've got to do everything. And, Brea does her thing and then I've got to do everything else, right? She's starting to rely on her teammates. I also think that the challenge that Adia had for all of her guards in Kansas that sort of flipped the season, right? Flipped the script for them. I think Jada sort of took that to heart, and so did everybody else, right? Paulina stepped up. So, Skylar is playing better. When you have all of your tools on the court with you and they're doing their job, then it's easier for her to do her job. She's not doing 1.5 or 2 jobs on the court. I also looked it up, and in those last 3 games, she's had 4.3 assists per game. Some games she's had 5 assists, and she's also pulled down about 5 rebounds per game. I think just she's now allowed to do the things that she does really well and then not force things, right? I think before she was forcing it. Now she's letting the game come to her. So, she was able to punctuate that run with, at the end of the game against West Virginia with those back-to-back threes, right? She was able to do that because it was in the flow of the offense and she felt good. And it wasn't all Jada, you got to do everything. So I think that as long as this keeps up, um, she'll be able to realize more about play like Jada can play, and everybody else will too. I think that was the real thing. The two things. The one is that Lauren Swan is finding her shot. Hopefully she'll be back soon. She had that concussion in the Cincinnati game. But then how everybody else picked it up, whether it was Skylar or Paulina, everybody else is doing their thing and their part. And that's what's made these last three games so good and so important for them. Is it's team ball. It's not just one player being a star or finding their groove. It's everybody.
Yeah, before Lauren Swan suffered that injury, no foul was called on the play, by the way, which is like sort of ridiculous that you could be concussed with an elbow and there's no call. But anyway, that's another topic for another time. They were using a lineup sometimes which had Lauren Swan, Paulina Paris, and Jada Williams all on the court at the same time with the two bigs, and that's basically 3 point guards. So that to me is a lineup that can be useful and helpful for Jada, like you said, not feel like she has to do everything. Now, that fivesome does not include Skylar Jones, who has been an incredible spark off the bench the last 2 games. She's 12 for 17 from the floor in those 2 games. I think she scored 16 points in each of those. And she had been you talked about the term rough patch earlier. Like Skylar had been in a major funk. Like you could see it in her expressions. She's like really down on herself. Like things wouldn't go well. She was not handling it well. She even talked about, after the game the other night, that Adia has told her to smile more on the court, like just to try to bring like a positive energy. I think when I watched this team play, she is the most raw talent of anyone on the team. Oh, yeah. Like she's a tremendous athlete. She is an absolute menace on defense. She's improved her 3-point shot. She can drive. She's learning to use her other hand. It's just, it's up and down. She's still a sophomore. And the mental side of the game is often the most challenging part for young players. But man, PJ, if they can get that version of Skylar Jones for the rest of the season, that's a difference maker for this team.
Oh, absolutely. She does things on offense, not just when she has the ball, but she'll cut across, right? Like she knows how the offense is supposed to work. Not everybody, while they're moving now and they're sharing the ball, there's something about what Sky does that she's just sort of, when she's in a good place, she can do what she needs to do. And that's not even talking about her defense. I mean, she really slowed down Hilton from Cincinnati. Nobody could really stop her. She ended up scoring, 25, 27 points. But when Skylar was on her, she only scored 6 points in that fourth quarter of that game. And she slowed down JJ Quinterly a little bit because nobody could really, she's like an all-star. So nobody could really stop her or whatever. But she was doing that. She's a great defender. She uses her length. She's got those long arms. And she just knows how to play the angles and do things. And it's just, she's a really important part of that team and of that class. I mean, when you look at that class, Montea, they like to reclassify her as a freshman, but when you look at the Brea and Jada and Skylar, Skylar could have the biggest upside of the three because she was like Sam Thomas, right? She was like ranked 80th or something in her class, and she was kind of overlooked and underrated and that kind of thing. And she's just really, when we saw at the end of last year, she took over games and she really helped them in the NCAA tournament game. And she really adds something that this team really needs, athletically as well, and on both ends of the court.
She was 96th in the Hoop Girls Top 100 in that class. She was initially committed to Missouri, kind of a late ad. You referenced Sam Thomas. Adia Barnes has mentioned how she likes, left-handed wings who can shoot it from the outside and defend. And Skylar certainly has that profile. Again, it's just a matter of the mental side of the game, because physically she has it all, everything that you could want in a player. And it's the mental side. It's handling failure as well as success. We talked about this a little bit offline, but there's a gazillion plays in a basketball game, right? I mean, it's back and forth. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to miss shots. You're going to turn the ball over. You got to flip the switch quickly and not let it affect you. And it's a process. She's learning how to do it. And it seems like she's maybe turning a corner in that regard the last couple of games. You noticed it too, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at her body language and her expressions.
The biggest thing for me is we talked to her after Cincinnati and we talked to her after West Virginia. And after Cincinnati, she talked about Adia lighting a fire under her butt and challenging her and all that kind of stuff. And she was fine. But then we saw her against West Virginia after that game. And I don't know if you noticed, but I had this in my notes. She sat up taller. She exuded confidence. She was talking about before they even went on to talk to us, they were talking about what the line was against them, and she knew. She was just like a completely different person. And you're like, that's the Skylar that we want to see, both for her as a player and as a person, right? She was like blooming in front of us. And that was really nice to see, because, we know she's gone through a tough time.
Right. And the other player I want to talk about is, and that's a perfect segue into it, is Montea Dew, who's also part of that class. And she's had a couple moments of like where you're like, okay, she's starting to feel comfortable with her knee. She's starting to get it. She's turning the corner. And then there's a game like West Virginia where she just isn't a factor. And she had no stats other than a couple of turnovers in 13 minutes. And we've seen the talent that she has. Like she's a smart player. She can block shots. She can shoot from outside a little bit. She's big enough to play inside. But her personality seems to be deferential. Like she's not a natural like alpha dog like Jada Williams, right? Like if you put Jada Williams's personality inside Montea Dew's, body, you'd have like probably an All-American. So again, I think it's a process for her. That might be naturally how she is. And then you add the knee on top of it. You add all the time off. And maybe unlike some of the other players on the team who are starting to figure it out, I feel like she's still in that finding her way mode right now.
Yeah. What I noticed about her against Cincinnati and what I really liked was they press a lot. And in the past, that's given Arizona some problems. And it's always like Jada trying to bring it up. And, and sometimes they're slow bringing up in the past and all that kind of stuff. But Montea was bringing the ball up, which was good because she's taller, right? And she could, it's good. And then against West Virginia, they had more of that. I think she was involved a little bit, but they did more of the passing to the bigs and then back to the guard to get it over the line because they press as well. But I noticed she was doing that, and I thought that was a good thing. She was a little more aggressive, I believe, in that game where she did some more stuff, and I think they ran some plays for her. I just, it's sort of, it reminds me of physical therapy, right? Like some days you're great, some days you're off, some days you're better. It's like that. And I think sort of that's what she's going through now. I also think like if you know, like if you were a quarterback and you had that injury or something and you got back out there and you got sacked and you get up and you'd be like, oh, my knee, it's okay. Right. And you would forget about it. I think because it's basketball and she just hasn't had like a hard hit or something and then gone or had to make a tough cut because this is all about making that same movement. Paulina talked to me about this. She said it's making that movement, that cut that you used to make before you got the injury. And if you can make that and then all of a sudden be like, oh, I didn't even think about it. I just did it. Like maybe that would sort of help her mentally get over it and then just be like, oh, I'm just going to play now. Right.
Right. In that Hoop Girls ranking from 2023, she was the highest of the four. She was number 8. And sometimes I feel like maybe she just needs a reminder, like, you're good. Like, you were a top 10 recruit for a reason. Like, go out and play like it. Like, but, confidence, you can't manufacture it either. Like, you need to have success. She has had, like I said, moments at this level, but it's very up and down. It's very inconsistent.
Right.
And so we'll see how she does here the rest of the way.
I will say with her is that for the most part, like when you look at other things on the court, like she plays defense really well, she doesn't get beat, right? She's solid and that kind of stuff. She knows the offense and where she's supposed to be. So she's doing all the other things. It's just she's not like aggressive taking her shot, or she's not just a little bit more aggressive. And that's what we all see. Most of us see. That's what most of the fans see, right? We're always talking about offense, right? How many points somebody scores, but it's hard to like step back and look at like those things that they did to help somebody get open to make that shot, right? She does all those things. They're just not flashy. We used to talk about Sam that way. Some people wouldn't see what Sam did because she didn't score a lot. Same thing with Helena, right? They just weren't aggressive or assertive. They had a great shot, but they didn't take it. They deferred to somebody else. Or once in a while, they take the 3 and knock it down, and everybody would be like, where is that, right? But they were doing all the other things to set everybody else up. They're such team players that they do this. And I think that's more of Montea's tendencies. And then you put on top of it all the things that happened to her. And so she's a little bit more reserved than probably even Sam or Helena at this point.
Right. I want to pivot to another sport. You sat down with Caitlin Lowe, the coach of the Arizona softball team, the other day, published a Q&A that can be found on our website, Tucson.com, as well as the Wildcaster app, Tucson.com app as well. I find to be a very easy and functional tool to read our stories. Softball season starts a little over a week from now, on February 6th, a week before baseball gets going. There's a huge tournament here in Tucson, with a bunch of good teams coming in. I think Arizona opens with a doubleheader against Michigan State. Tell me what you learned from your sit down with Caitlin Lowe about what the 2025 Wildcats might look like.
I think the biggest thing I learned is that this year's team probably has the most depth of any of her teams since she's been head coach here. And especially when she looks at whether it's something with the lineup, whether it's the infield, she's not going to tip her hand to me right now, right, about who's starting at first, second, or third. We all know that Taylor Beal is locked in at shortstop, but we don't know the other 3 positions, and she's not saying that. But she's got like a couple people at second, a couple people at third, even more at first, because you've got Devin Netz and Miranda Stoddard, who will be playing at various times at first besides pitching, and even they hit, so there'll be designated players too at points. But and she's got a catcher who could play first base. I mean, it goes down the line, which she told me is going to be really fun for her because she can actually do really a lot of situational strategy this year. And so if somebody, whatever happens to be during the game, it's not like looking on the bench and seeing who's left could to be your pinch hitter, right? Or something. It's like she can really look at it and figure it out, like who would be the best person, not only for the team, but also she said that she can use the athletes as more to their abilities, right? Because she's got all this depth. So she knows that somebody is better hitting in this situation or against a lefty or against a lefty that throws this way or something. Then she can have that person in. So that I think is going to be one thing that's going to be completely different from what we've seen in the past. And the other thing is the pitching. They have a healthy squad for the first time in a while, and they have 8 pitchers. So we'll be seeing more of a pitching by committee because that's sort of the new way to go. And that's what Christian Conrad, their pitching coach, that's sort of his philosophy right now on pitching. And so there's going to be a lot of different things like that. It should be a really interesting season. I'm excited to watch them and to see, who's going to rise, who's going to, especially of the freshmen, big freshman class. And we're going to be, as usual, we're going to be seeing a lot of them, in the lineup and playing in these games.
Yeah, there's been a bit of a flip as far as like where the experienced, established position players are. It had been in the infield. It's more so now in the outfield with Dakota Kennedy and Reagan Shockey kind of holding things down out there. They do have a returning starting catcher in Emily Shep. You mentioned Taylor Beal at shortstop, and a lot of pieces to be figured out at the other spots. Getting some girls back from injury is, of course, helpful, but isn't 8 pitchers like a crazy big amount for a softball team?
It seems like
8,
a lot.
8 viable arms. Like I can't remember seeing a team that has that many, but I think they're taking a different approach to it. I mean, they're going to play matchups a lot. They don't have, that one, clear-cut ace who's going to pitch the majority of the time. But I was actually over at the softball offices today for something I'm working on, and talked to Caitlin Lowe and talked to Kenzie Quinn about this a little bit. And softball's changing a little bit in that regard. There are only a handful of those, supreme ace pitchers out there anymore. One of them happens to be in Arizona's conference now, with Najari Kennedy coming from Stanford to Texas Tech. But a lot of teams are relying more on that kind of a committee approach, having multiple viable arms that you can use to match up. They said the scouting has improved so much now that you kind of need to do that, and then if they see the same pitcher, maybe 2-3 times in a game, maybe they kind of figure out how to hit them. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle that and whether it puts a ceiling on what they can do. Do you have to have that number one ace pitcher to go as far as Arizona teams in the past have gone, or can you use a whole staff approach and still get there? So I don't know. It always comes back to the circle, doesn't it?
It does. It always does. I mean, every year, what do we say? Well, if only they had this, right? It's always the pitcher. It's not anything. They always have the hitting. They always have, great defense. And it always comes down to the circle.
It always does. And they have been an elite defensive team under Caitlin Lowe and Lauren Lappin, who's their infield coach. They did make one change in the staff this year. They brought in a new hitting coach whose name escapes me from Arizona State.
Amber, somebody. I don't. Yeah, the last name. Her last name escapes
me.
Me.
Amber Freeman. Yes.
Freeman. Yes.
Brian Amber Freeman. So that's always an interesting thing to watch too. When you change hitting coaches, I know that there was some girls were not super happy with the approach that was taken a year ago. So Caitlin Lowe made a change, and we'll see if that results in anything different. It's not like they were a bad hitting team by any stretch, but a couple of the returning players, their production fell off a little bit. They didn't have as much power. That'll be something to watch. I mentioned Dakota Kennedy and Reagan Shockey. Those are kind of the standouts returning to that lineup. A couple of really incredible weapons. Both hit 400 plus last year. Reagan Shockey, we know, maybe one of the fastest players in America, and Dakota Kennedy can kind of do it all, right? Like elite glove in left field. She's got power. She hits for average. Just a potential All-American in the making. So, softball is coming soon. Busy time for us at the Arizona Daily Star. As always, I love the spring season. It's kind of my, right up there with fall, among my favorite times of the year. There's always a lot going on. Basketball still going, softball getting started, baseball getting started. It's a lot of fun stuff. You can catch all of my work and PJ's work and our colleague Justin Spears' work and all of our teammates at Tucson.com, the Wildcaster app as well. You can listen to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube Music. Please drop us a review. 5 stars would be great, and send us some comments as well. We always love to get feedback from you guys. Likely to have Bruce Pasco on soon to talk about U of A men's basketball, and then I will join forces again with Justin Spears in the not too distant future to talk about what's going on with football. We thank PJ Brown for joining us today to break down the U of A women's basketball team and a little bit of softball. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we will see you next time.